Okay. Hi, everybody again. Welcome back from probably the lamest spring break you've ever had in your life, if not most horrible, if not most agonizing. I actually missed you last week. I don't know, there was something about not having class and me staying up to 2 to 3 in the morning watching HBO or Netflix and sleeping in. And I just kept telling my husband, I was like, I'm on spring break. Let me sleep in. And laying around in sweatpants all day and not even, brushing my hair and putting makeup on. That was actually a little more depressing than the usual depressing. It was like a couple of steps down. So I am happy to be back with you in this really weird, teaching situation. Sorry to be on such a lame page here. This is not very exciting. So let me move my little head up here. I should put it like really under here so I look more into the camera. And let me go to my notes. So I can't put my head there. See, I still just am figuring all this crap out. All right, so I did something different today because I'm a little sick of PowerPoints. I just find PowerPoints so agonizing. So I actually made just like some note sheets for these two chapters that I will post. I will post on Blackboard for you so that you could just print them out or you could just download them or save them or whatever. So this is kind of like our lecture today, but instead of it going through a PowerPoint presentation, I'm just going to kind of use these like guided notes to help us get through. So welcome back to Kindred. A lot of you wrote me saying that, one, you actually liked the book, which is great because if nothing else, I hope that reading can help you, get away from reality right now. Some of you wrote me saying that you're having a hard time reading in your home because, there's so many people in your house and nobody is quiet and, you can't find any quiet time. And I completely agree. Like every time I sit down to read during the day, like sometimes I'll sit with my daughter on her bottom bunk and try to read, I fall asleep. If I sit on the couch and try to read, I fall asleep. I'm realizing that I really only read on the subway where I have to sit up. And even actually then sometimes I fall asleep. So when I've been reading is when I try to go to bed at night because I've had a lot of insomnia. So I kind of just read and read and read until my eyes start to kind of flutter shut and then realize that maybe my body will finally let itself go to sleep at that point. For some reason, I can sleep totally during the day if I sit down to read. But when I lay down at night to go to bed, my eyes are like, it's like one of those cartoons, like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. Do you guys even know what that is? Where it's like there's toothpicks like stuck in my eyelids, like holding my eyes open like this. So that's the only time I get reading done. So last night I went to bed and I was like, oh shit, I haven't done the reading for class today. And I wasn't even caught up. And I was getting emails from you guys being like, I haven't been able to finish the reading. I'm like, yeah, me either. So I actually read and I finished The Fire, and I thought we actually had to read The Fight for today because I had not consulted my own syllabus because, I'm not perfect, sadly. And I got like a few pages, maybe like 10 pages into The Fight before I finally fell asleep at like 1 a.m. So today we are discussing The Fire and the Fall. So if you look at the chapter titles, so I'm going to start on my notes here so you can just follow along. I wish I had like a bouncy ball. I read bouncy ball that would just bounce as I talked and I wouldn't have to do it. So if you look at all the chapter titles in the book, you maybe are picking up on the fact that each title represents a situation that Rufus gets himself into that then requires Dana's help. And this, him putting himself in danger kind of pulls her from the 20th century backwards in time to the 19th century, which is the 1800s. So remember, anytime it's a century, like if it's the 20th century, it's the 1900s, the 19th century is the 1800s. Right now we're in the 21st century because we're in the 20s, like 2020. So here, maybe you can see these. Oh, yeah, I always forget they go backwards. But excuse me. So there's the river, the fall. Oh, sorry, the river, the fire, the fall. We read the river. We'll do the fire and the fall today. Then the fight, the storm, and the rope. So none of these sound good, right? Every situation is kind of dire, and Rufus is in some sort of jeopardy, and that seems to be what triggers the time traveling for Dana. All right, so a couple things to note about character and setting in the fire. Okay, I think you probably get all of this stuff on like Spark Notes online. But I think to myself about what I should do in these lectures, and I think, well, what would I do if we were in class? And I was like, well, we would have some time to quickly make sure we're all understanding the text in the same way of like what actually happens, who is introduced, what's happening with the characters, and then we would have time for like discussion about like making meaning of the text, like, you know, what is the purpose of the text, like what is the author trying to communicate to us, how is this like a traditional slave narrative? How does it break from a traditional slave narrative? How is it like a neo-slave narrative? And what does this text have to do with the racial imagination, which is the topic of our course? I remember back in the day when we saw each other for a brief moment there when we talked about it. This course title is Octavia Butler and the Racial Imagination. So that's kind of what I'm just going to run through today. And I'll put some options at the end of things we could maybe do in the next few weeks together. Okay, so chapter 2, the fire. This is trip number 2, time traveling trip number 2 for Dana. All right, so notes on the characters and settings. So when she travels back this time, Rufus is older. She has only been home a couple of days, but years have passed for him. Now, for those of you who are mathematicians, or perhaps if in, you know, all my extra time, why don't I have extra time? I feel like I should have lots of extra time. You could try to figure out like kind of an analysis, like a time analysis, like, you know, in the first one where it was the river, she seemed to be gone for like, you know, 10 or 15 minutes. But for Kevin, her husband, whom she left behind, it was, you know, like a split second. So what is the ratio? That's what I'm looking for, of like time in the 20th century to time in the 18th century here. The 19th century. So what is, if she's gone for 1 second in the 19th century and it's 15 minutes in the 18th century, like she's gone for 1 second in the 20th century and it's, 1 second in the 20th century and it's 15 minutes in the 19th century. What's the ratio of time? Because as the book progresses, she stays in 1815, 1819 for longer and longer periods of time. So it's not just like a fleeting instant, it's several hours, it's several weeks, it's several months, it's several years. So every chapter, her time increases, which you'll see as the book gets going. So maybe, you know, for some of you guys who are, you know, into ratios or stats or numbers, you could figure out that equation for me. So when she gets to Rufus's house and the second trip, Rufus is older. He was about 5 the first time she met him when he was drowning in the river. Now he seems to be maybe like 7 or so. He has accidentally set his bedroom curtains on fire, and Dana shows up in his bedroom in the evening and puts the fire out. So her and Rufus start to talk this time. The first time she didn't get to talk to him because he was unconscious. She just pulled him out of the river. The mother's like screaming at her. She had to resuscitate him. And then the dad, remember, held a shotgun to her head. And that's what triggered her to go back to 1976 to her house in California. So this time, when she travels back to, 1815, you can see here she gets the year out of him. Rufus is older, so he was about 5 years old in the river, and now he's like 7 or 8. He has set his bedroom curtains on fire. She sits down and talks to Rufus because, actually 8-year-olds are quite lovely to talk to, and gets this information out of him. The year that she travels to in the fire is 1815. All right. His dad is Tom Whalen. She gets the dad's name. They are located in Maryland, which is part of the American South. So Dana realizes that not only does she travel years, she also travels space. But it doesn't seem like she travels time of day. So if I'm making this lecture for you and it's 4:16 p.m., Dana travels 3,000 miles across the United States, across 3 time zones. So if she was in California at 4:16 p.m. and then she travels to Maryland, she notices that it's already dark there, but she says, oh, that makes sense because now I'm on the East Coast. So it seems like there's something about the minutes of the day, the hour of the day that is steady. However, the year changes and the geographic location changes in her time travel experience. I don't know why this is saying this. Okay, so his dad is Tom Whalen. They are in Maryland in the American South. So Dana travels both time and space, and she travels to a plantation. So a plantation is in the American South during this time period. It's an agricultural business that used slave labor for ultimate profit, because if the labor is free, the owner reaps all the profit made from the crops. So, it's like if Chipotle didn't pay anybody and just kept all of our money, but they didn't pay any of their employees, they would just make so much more money. They make way more money than if they even had to pay people minimum wage. So I have a couple of images here from you. I'm going to reduce this. Let's see if I can do this. So I am from the American South, and I've spent a lot of time studying the history of slavery, the economies of slavery, reading a lot of slave narratives, because as a white Southerner, I actually feel like it's my ethical and social responsibility to understand this institution that defined the geographic location from which I came. I don't know if my family ever owned people. I'm just saying this for transparency. It's a little complicated because I was adopted, and I don't know my biological father's side of the family. They're actually still in Western Virginia. It seems like they were very poor white people, but that doesn't mean at one point they didn't have more wealth. Wealth can kind of shift around from time to time. But that's a much longer story that you don't really need. I'm not going to go into and put publicly in this lecture, but happy to talk to you anytime you'd like about it. However, just in case some of you, I know a lot of you aren't, you came to this country in middle school or high school, you probably got some American history that was really boring and or potentially, not taught in the exciting way that it could be taught. So let me just explain a little geography to you. My dad was a geographer, my dad who raised me. So the American South. So the American South, believe it or not, starts in Maryland. This line right here, this is called like the Mason-Dixon line. I wonder if I can look that up. The exact line. Wikipedia is kind of a crap source, but it's still helpful. So the Mason-Dixon line is what delineated the North from the South. Pennsylvania was a free state. If any of you watched Harriet as an extra credit movie, you'll see that she was trying to escape into Philadelphia because it was a free state. And remember that image of the Quakers, the Quaker Oats guy. So the Mason-Dixon line is this like hard line here that down below the Mason-Dixon line were slave-owning states and above were not. So in this image here of the South, West Virginia, Virginia, Kentucky is kind of like the top of the South. The red states were the Deep South, are still called the Deep South. Deep South is consistently thought to include most or all the states shown in red, overlaps into portions in orange. while the census considers Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Oklahoma part of the South, they're not typically attached to the Deep South geographic label. And this is interesting because where'd that come from? When I grew up in Virginia, I did not know I was a Southerner until I was 16 and I moved to North Carolina. And as soon as I moved to North Carolina and I went to high school there, it was the middle of my junior year, people would come up to me and be like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "You guys are so ass backwards." But I came to love North Carolina very deeply. And I was like, "I'm from Virginia, you crazy people." And they're like, "Oh, okay, you're from the South." And I was like, "What? No, I'm not." I don't feel deeply Southern because my mom was from Michigan and a military brat, moved all over. And my dad was from Jersey. So I wasn't raised by Southern parents. However, I was raised in Virginia and North Carolina. And that's where I lived until I was 25 when I moved to New York City. I have been in New York City for 21 years in June. So I still have lived in the South longer than I've lived in the North. So I still consider myself a Southerner. So the Deep South includes South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. South are all of these states included here. I was kind of raised in the north of the South in Virginia until I was 16, and then in North Carolina. Did you see that I just had a little tiny accent there? Sometimes it comes out. My Southern accent will really come out if I am drinking with other Southerners. And then I just sound like I've never left. So that's just a little geography for you there about where the South is. Now, in terms of slavery and the history of slavery, it is pretty well known across literature of slavery and history of slavery that being a slave anywhere was not a good situation. However, being a slave in the Deep South was far more dangerous, and the life expectancy was far lower. The work conditions were more extreme. The violence against enslaved Africans was far more extreme. And it just wasn't, if you were sold from Maryland to go down into the Deep South, it was pretty much like a death sentence. So it was often a threat to slaves in the north of the South that if you didn't behave or if you tried to run away and were caught, that you would end up being sold down the river, was the expression. And that pretty much meant you would be sold down into the Deep South, which was pretty much like signing a death sentence for you. So it was considered a far more dangerous place because of the different crops that were grown down there, the heating conditions, and the more violence against slaves down there, largely often backed by Christian values. So let's go with this one. I thought this was an interesting thing that I found. So this is from the 2000 census data. So this is called the Black Belt of the United States. My mom, the Bible Belt kind of stretches across here. My mom was telling me yesterday on the phone that the reason the Bible Belt hadn't gotten many coronavirus cases is because there's so many Christians there. And the reason that New York is getting them all is because we're all sinners. And that is when I hung up the phone. But this is called the Black Belt. This is the counties in which the African American population is 40% or higher across the South of the United States. And this is largely based on the history of slavery. All of African Americans who lived here were largely brought over through triangular trade from West Africa to grow crops in this area. And these are the people who stayed and did not leave during the Great Migration of the teens and 20s. The Great Migration was after slaves were freed with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. My bad. It went into effect January 1st, 1863. Slaves were freed by Abraham Lincoln, and, the Civil War ended in 1865. However, that's when the KKK rose to power and Jim Crow segregation. So a lot of slaves fled in the Great Migration from the American South to, let's see if we can see, cities in the North, such as Chicago, which is here, Philadelphia, then Baltimore and DC, which was at least the north of the South and not quite as horrible, Boston, New York. And then you had some, kind of like rogue and, renegade families that went west, and that's how you have a large population of people of African Americans in California, and or join the military in the 20th century, and then you get a small smattering of African Americans on the West Coast. But that's, large, and Detroit. They went up to Detroit, which was a big factory city at the time with lots of work. Also Ohio, which was a free state for work, and Indiana. So that was the Great Migration that pulled those people out of the South and into the North. And then this represents kind of all the places where people still stayed. And they're not the majority of these counties, but they're 40% or higher. All right. Okay, so let's keep talking about a little geography here. So this doesn't come up until, I believe, this comes up in the fire. We find out that the plantation, Rufus mentions that his dad whipped him at a certain point, and then he was sent to live in Baltimore with an aunt when he set a barn on fire. So she says, Dana asks him, oh my gosh, are we in Baltimore? Like, she knows Baltimore. And he's like, no, we're across the water. So their plantation is in this place called Tidewater, Maryland. It's really like beautiful country. So it's over here in Maryland. So if you scroll out, here we are in New York, and this is where this part of the book takes place. So, it's not that far away, honestly. Here's Philly. This is where a lot of slaves would escape to. But, far if you have to walk, right? So if you zoom in, they never mention the water throughout the story, so he's probably inland pretty far. But this is Washington, D.C. here, and I know you all care, so I'm going to show you. Let's see. And this is where I kind of grew up, right around here in Virginia. So like I said, it's from Northern Virginia, like the north of the South, like very close to DC. My dad worked in there. So that's why I didn't really know I was in the South, because the Mason-Dixon line was, I grew up here in Virginia. Mason-Dixon line's right there. It's practically the north. All right, so we did Maryland. We did that. All right, so plantations. Plantations in the Deep South have a architectural history of being quite stunning and beautiful. Although there are still a lot of plantations open in the South for plantation tours, and they kind of celebrate this Southern way of life that was made on the exploitation and brutality and enslavement of Black bodies. So I have never visited one of these places in real life because I find it extremely effed up that you would go and visit one of these, and they of course tell the story like, oh, the slaves were treated really well here, and they were happy slaves, they would sing. There's a really kind of twisted historical notion. There is one plantation which if we ever get in, this one is outside of New Orleans. It is temporarily closed because of coronavirus. So, if at some point we are all let out of our houses, and yet by then y'all will be over 21, so you should go down to New Orleans and, party it up because you'll be of legal drinking age. Actually, I think in New Orleans you can drink at 18. Is that right? I don't know. Well, just fact check me on that one. But this is the only plantation in this United States that gives you a plantation tour from the perspective of the history of slavery. So it has a completely different idea than, most of these homes that will give you, a plantation tour, and just so you can like ooh and ah over these like beautiful homes and the Spanish moss and like all the white columns, and oh, it's so beautiful. And they're just going to completely take out or maybe briefly mention just a little bit. Oh yeah, he owns like 500 slaves to run all the land, and and they're not going to mention rape or murder or lynching or whipping or any of the stuff that happened. But this tour, which I've been on twice, I went once with my husband, and then we took our kids there last February, not 2020, obviously, but 2019, will give you a really solid education on plantation life, the horrors of it from the perspective of slavery. So I highly recommend that at some point in the future, you go there. And in fact, I know that one of the professors did a New Orleans Global Gutman once upon a time, and he took students here. That was many years ago, though. Okay, so, however, these are very big and beautiful plantation homes. But Dana, when she sees Rufus's house, and she doesn't actually see the house from the front, but she mentions it in the next chapter. It is called a Georgian colonial house, and this is what those look like. So it's much more modest looking. Maybe there'll be a few pillars if they got that pizzazz going, but it's not a plantation home like this. Like something that's like the size bigger than the White House, and it's it's just kind of like brick and square. Like my husband grew up in a house that looks like this, but much smaller. Maybe if you just cut off the windows on each side in Connecticut and took off the third floor, so it's just a more modest, because the Whalens are not a wealthy plantation or a wealthy family. Although Margaret, the wife, would like you to believe that. Okay, I think those are all my visuals for you. So let's go back to the notes. Whenever you're reading a book, if you can't visualize the setting or a space because you don't have personal experience with it, just Google image some things, because it will help give you some context and bolster your ability to understand the text and to imagine the spaces. Okay, so we went over that. Okay, so now we're still on the fire here. So details to note about the plot in the fire. So Dana pieces together in this chapter that Rufus is one of her ancestors. So she recalls this old family Bible that she had that has a family tree drawn inside it. I'm not sure if any of you have one of these from your families. So she remembered the name Rufus because it's kind of like a ugly, weird name. Sorry, nobody in this class is named Rufus. Who was married to Alice Green something Whalen, and that they had a baby named Hagar, which is a name out of the Old Testament. It's actually a big name, Jewish name. Hagar is born in 1831, and dies in 1880. So if the year is currently 1815, Hagar is not going to be born for another 16 years, and Hagar has to be born to ensure that Dana will be born. So this means that Dana is going to have to protect this daredevil child who seems to get himself into all sorts of trouble all the time for the next 16 years of his life to ensure that her ancestral line is continued so that she can exist in the future, right? So here is the time travel equation, the the thing that's like, oh, snap, this is who you are, this is who I am, this is our connection. And for some reason, I am being pulled back to you to be your kind of guardian angel so that I can ensure that my ancestor will be born so that I will be born. Got it? All right. So Hagar married somebody named Oliver Blank. They have 7 children. So Dana is like the potentially great grandchild of Hagar and Oliver. So they have 7 kids. Probably one of these kids has a kid who has Dana. Right? So she needs to make sure that Rufus not only stays alive, but what becomes more complicated in future chapters is that he will have to have a baby with Alice. Alice is the little girl that we also meet in the fire. She is a free, African-American girl, and he is a white boy. So you can imagine that this is not going to be, this might be a complicated relationship. All right. So this is one of the questions that we talked about. So Dana is being called to Rufus in times of danger for him to protect him, to ensure his survival. He has to make it to 1831 as well, so that he can make this baby, right? So that she can one day exist. All right, so Dana then has this conversation with Rufus. She figures out all of this stuff. So she has to get out of his house because she can't be found in his bedroom in the middle of the night. So he sneaks her out of the house, tells her how to go, tells her to go to Alice's cabin. So Alice is a little girl at this point, but Alice's mother is a free woman. She's not enslaved. So she does not live on their plantation. She lives adjacent to it. And he says, you can go to her for help. But once she gets there, Alice's husband, who is a slave, is found in her house without a permission to visit his wife. So he's beaten like horribly by patrollers. Patrollers are pretty much the precursor to the KKK. They were hired by plantation owners to patrol around, and actually the precursor to the police, to patrol around, find slaves who weren't where they were supposed to be, full liberty to use violence against them, but not kill them, because remember, slaves are property and they're worth a lot of money. So she witnesses, this is her first visualization of violence against an enslaved African body. They take him away. She meets Alice and her mom. She looks exactly like Alice's mom. She's about to sleep there and spend the night there, but then one of the patrolmen comes back to rape Alice's mom, or maybe Alice too. Let's not think about the raping of children, but that was actually not uncommon as well. So Dana gets involved, obviously. He starts to attack Dana instead. She has this moment where her life is threatened, and that moment then sends her back to 1976. Okay? Boom. Fire complete. Questions? No, I can't hear you because I'm talking to myself in a computer. Okay, so let's go to chapter 3, the fall. So this is trip number 3 for Dana, trip number 1 for Kevin. So she brings Kevin with her on this trip, not on purpose, just because he was hugging her. I think he was probably trying to keep her from going, but instead he went with her body. So details to note on character and setting. Before they travel together, Dana tells the story of meeting Kevin through this temp job that they had. A temp job, I don't know if these even exist anymore. I know they existed when I moved here in 99, is you go to an agency and you give them all of your skills and they put you in this big pool of temporary workers, and you pretty much get pimped out to different businesses that need you for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 months. And they pay like a flat fee, which is typically more than minimum wage because you're assumed to have some skills or education beyond high school. But back in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was very common, probably long before that, since this was in the 70s that she meets him. So she gives kind of your backstory about how she met Kevin, how they fell in love, all that good stuff, just so you know who they are a little bit before all this started happening to them. But now that she knows she's gone twice to Rufus, she prepares a bag to bring with her. She puts essentials into it. She puts a map of Maryland, even though it's, completely not dated correctly in terms there's no roads or highways at this point in the 19th century. But as she gets pulled back to Rufus this time, Kevin grabs her and he travels with her. So the situation is Rufus has fallen out of a tree and broken his leg very badly. He's with this kid Nigel, who's Rufus's, it's hard to say friend because Nigel's their a slave owned by Rufus's family, but they're boys the same age, so they hang out. While Nigel goes to get Rufus's dad, Dana and Kevin explain to Rufus that they're from 1976 and that they're time traveling, and they show him coins, like change with dates on it to prove them. And it sounds crazy, but there's no other real explanation for it, so he just kind of buys it. So Rufus explains more how he can see them, like when he's kind of falling into a bad situation, he almost has like a vision of Dana wherever she is at the time, whether it's in her living room or her bedroom. And he can kind of see her as he's entering into this danger, and then he kind of like pulls her to him. So this is one of the questions I asked you in your reading and discussion post, is like, who has the power in this relationship? Like, all relationships have power dynamics, whether it's, children and parents, professors and students, like brothers and sisters, friends, boyfriend and girlfriend. There's always power involved in different ways. So in this way, Rufus does seem, he controls her. Like she has no control over the situation. So it's really like an interesting metaphor for, the time period that he pulls her to, where as a white man and her as a black woman, he controls her in this space too. So he has this kind of like layered control over her that's, you would think for her would be very disempowering, but at the same time, she is a woman of the, 20th century. She's lived a life of freedom and of, education and of modern conveniences. So she kind of isn't really willing to take his shit in a lot of ways. Like, she kind of pushes back against him a little bit, but she knows she can't push too much because he could just have her killed. So there's this, power dynamic where he holds most of this power, but as like a more modern woman, she has some as well. So Dana and Kevin are then invited to stay at the plantation there. So here's some notes on the plot. So I'm going to take some allergy medicine. Okay. It's just homeopathic stuff that I'm trying to take to. My eyes are really itchy right now because my cat's in the room. Can you see her? Where she is? Where is she? There she is. Is she on the bed? She's very fluffy. All right. I digress. Details to note on the plot. So they find out they're in 1819. So this is a bit. Okay, sorry, I got to get these under my tongue so it dissolve. And they're not going anywhere. So they have to acclimate to the setting in order to survive. They can't control when they're going to go back. What they do know is that Kevin has to be with Dana to travel back. He cannot travel on his own. She is the point of travel. Now, they can't be together at all times at this point because that's not normal in society in 1819 for a white man and a black woman to like be inseparable. Like, that's just not at all normal. So they're put in this situation that's really challenging, where she will not travel back until her life is in jeopardy. But why would her life be in jeopardy if Kevin was actually there? So they're one, afraid of getting separated. But two, Dana really, starts to express her fears on page 77 that in order to survive at this time period, Kevin is going to have to pretend like he agrees with the institution of slavery and that, black bodies are inferior and subhuman. And she has like this inkling of fear that he might change from this experience. So I'm just giving you some little pieces here. Like, they decide on page 79, she has to become a slave to survive here. I mean, she's pretending that she's Kevin's slave, and she has to do the work of a slave now. So her previous two trips did not require this of her, but now she actually has to play the part. Like, this isn't, she can't watch from the outside anymore. She needs to go in and kind of like go into, she's like an undercover person pretending to be a slave here. But she has to walk the walk, or else she will not survive. Rufus's parents do not like Dana because she can read and write, and she talks like an educated black person, which they have never experienced in their lives, and it's very suspicious to them. They also don't want her to bring literacy to their slaves so we can give them ideas of freedom. So his parents are really nasty to her, and he tries to protect her, but he's actually still just a kid in this. He's probably like this is 1819. It was 1815 there, so he's probably like 12 or 13. So on page 92, Dana witnesses her first whipping, which is in every slave narrative ever, because it was so visceral. On page 97, page 98, and 101, she starts to feel both herself and Kevin acclimating to this time period. They've been there for months now, and they're just becoming part of the fabric of this society. And that, as a person of color, is not sitting well with her at all. Dana can't resist reading. She keeps getting in trouble for reading, and she starts to teach Nigel, the young slave boy Rufus's age, to read, but she gets caught reading by Tom Whalen. And then on page 107, Tom Whalen whips Dana for reading, and this propels her back to 1976 without Kevin. So now she's back home, and he's trapped in the past, and she doesn't know like when she will be pulled back there. Like she could, be pulled back the next day, but it'll be, 3 years later in, it won't be 1819 anymore. She knows that. So every minute and every hour that goes by is days or weeks or months for Kevin. So they're not tracking at the same way anymore in terms of time. Like he's experiencing time very differently than her, and they're separated, which is her biggest nightmare. So thinking about these two chapters and what we talked about last lecture on, is this a slave narrative or a neo-slave narrative? So there are a lot of elements in this book that pretty much follow the slave narrative. So she gives you, instead of her I was born story, which we'll actually get more in the next chapters about the people she comes from, she starts giving us a story about her and Kevin's relationship. Kevin being white is a key point in this book. This would be a very different story if her husband was black. And we can talk about that as the book concludes, so keep that in the back of your mind. Description of the cruel Tom Whalen and Margaret Whalen, account of Alice's father, Alice's father, who defies orders and visits his wife, and then she witnesses him getting beaten. Nigel asking Dana to teach him to read and write. Carrie 2, description of the foods the slaves eat, the corn mush. Description of children sold from parents. Sarah telling her how Tom Whalen sold all of her sons. Description of patrols at night when they take Alice's dad and beat him. Description of Dana witnessing her first whipping of another slave, and description of receiving her first whipping. So these are all like checkbox, check of qualities of a slave narrative. So how is this different? Like, how is this book different? Well, obviously it's time travel. This time travel component brings you down here that the positionality of our narrator, of Dana, she's a person who's lived her life in the 20th century as a free Black woman. If she's 26-ish in 1976, that means that she lived through the Civil Rights Movement. And she's narrating this experience of being an enslaved African in the 19th century to us through the lens of a woman who is more like us than she is like the, enslaved Africans who are living in this time period. She's literate, she's educated, she's moved freely around her whole life. Of course, she's probably experienced racism. She's experienced tragedy, but she's never been enslaved. She's never worked for nothing, right? This interracial relationship gives us a whole different perspective in terms of a slave narrative, because it's one by choice. It's not one by violence or rape. This idea of this neo-slave narrative is this concept of your ancestral connections and as time as being circular, not linear. So I should have tried to find it for you. I wonder if I can pull it up here really fast. I don't think it's down here. Is it down here? Okay. I think I found it. This is how random. This is like one of my favorite images. I keep thinking I'm going to get a tattoo with it. You can see it. We're not talking about, this is actually a whole learning model, but we're not talking about that. But if you think about time as linear, like you're born here, you die here, right? This is how we have to live our lives. Like we can't, unless we can time travel, which I don't know if any of you have, but I haven't. We live our lives in a linear fashion. Like, we age in a linear way, etc. But what this story is kind of exploring with us is that like your connections to your ancestors are not necessarily linear. They can kind of circulate through you throughout your life. And there are moments where they intersect with your life where they feel really strong. And there's moments where they will feel further away. So whether it's like grandparents or parents or great grandparents or like ancestors that are 3 or 4 generations ago, that they live inside you in some way. And Dana is experiencing this literally. Like she is sitting in spaces with her ancestors and understanding the life they lived, in a way that like none of us are privy to doing because we can't time travel. But what it's giving her is this depth of understanding of what her family went through in order for her to be where she is at this time. I know you've probably seen those t-shirts that I've seen lots of like young Black people wearing that say like, I am my ancestors' greatest dream or something like that. And that's kind of what this text is like all about, is that, the people that made her endured so much that, she couldn't really understand it until she lived it, which, we don't get that option largely, but we can try to do our homework and research and understand and read and go back and dig around and do, the work to try to get it. But you never get it the way that they got it at that time. One of the things that with Dana's time travel is that this circular time that she's experiencing shows up on her physical body. So when she goes back in time after she's whipped by Tom Whalen, which sends her back to 1976, she comes back into her house covered with lashes. And those aren't going away. Like that's something that Octavia Butler chose to do as an author. Like when she traveled through time back and forth, the author chose to have her carry the burden in her body back and forth across the centuries. When she's beaten up at the end of this chapter, she's attacked and almost raped and beaten. She appears back in her house covered in blood and bruises. When she's whipped at the end of this chapter, she appears back in her house. There she is. She appears back in her house covered in blood and lashes. And since Kevin's not there, she actually has to take care of herself. And those scars will stay on her body forever, which, is could be a statement. I'm not sure if this is what Octavia Butler was trying to get at here about the trauma that is inflicted on her body kind of demonstrates this circular time pattern. But, when Octavia Butler wrote this book in the 70s, there wasn't this research that's out today on generational trauma, on how the trauma that was experienced through your ancestors at any given point, whether it's the trauma of migration or immigration, or there's a lot of research on the trauma of surviving the Holocaust, or, the trauma of having been enslaved, how that actually shifts your DNA a bit. And that trauma can be passed in some ways to generations after you. But Dana's body actually shows the physical trauma of this circular time of her ancestors, because she actually gets to go back and spend time with them. So what is this book? It's my last point here. We're coming to an end. What does this book have to do with the racial imagination? Here are the pages where I thought there was stuff coming up where Dana herself is just like, oh my gosh, like I thought I knew, but I don't know. Largely, what it's exploring here, and so keep your eyes open for this for other times, is the idea that we can imagine what it must have been like in this time period to have been enslaved, to live in a plantation, to experience the violence, to live in fear. We can read the narratives, we can read the history, we can do the research, but what she experiences here is that even with everything you've ever imagined and everything you've ever studied, nothing is like the real experience. So one of you, I think it was you, Sherman, and I were texting about the time difference and how 1 minute in 1976 is like 20 minutes, in 1815, and about that ratio of time and how the time is longer when she goes back in time than when she's in 1976. And what does that mean? Like, is that a metaphor? Is it a symbol for something? And, I was saying how maybe when Sherman and I were texting, maybe this is symbolic of like this time spent as an enslaved African is just like torturously long. Like, compared to the free life of Dana in 1976. Maybe that's what the ratio has to do with. What she's realizing in all of these pages is where she has these moments of clarity where she's like, I thought I knew, but this is way beyond what my imagination could even ever construct. So keep looking for stuff like that as the book goes on. These moments where Dana has moments of these realizations that what she thought was the experience of her ancestors was far more complex and challenging than she could have ever anticipated. Okay, I think I've taught a lot. Sorry these lectures are getting so long. I read something once that said they should be like 10 minutes. I mean, I guess I could give you a 10-minute lecture every single day and make you watch it, but nobody got time for that. I just got to hit it and quit it, right? So your homework. All right, so it says for this week's homework, what you're supposed to do is read The Fight and The Storm. Both of those chapters are extremely long. I didn't actually I did look at the pages, but I think we're just going to do The Fight for next week. Excuse me. Sorry, I should cough into my elbow. So just read The Fight. We'll just take one extra week with this because, we're not exactly desperate for time, and push everything back a little. So we'll take 1 week for The Fight. We have 1 week for The Storm. Then we'll do Rope and Epilogue. And then we'll just keep clicking away here. I mean, this is week 7. So we're, halfway done. Yeah. Fist bump. Please text me if you need anything. I will post this. I'll post your reading and discussion post for next week. Please just keep in touch. I tried to check in with a lot of you over the break. I know a lot of you are sick and or have sick parents and are dealing with a lot of stuff. So again, there are no real due dates. I recommend you do the work by Monday, but all the posts are open and you can still put any of the assignments in there, and I'll just keep going through and checking them. And let me know how you are, just even to say hi. All right. I miss you guys a lot. And I think about you every single day. Be in touch.